Thank you for listening to Shulchanaruchharav.com.
The halachic controversy surrounding brain death. Many of you may have heard, and unfortunately some of you may have become personally acquainted with the very complex and anxiety-filled discussion of the determination of death according to Jewish law, and whether one is to follow brain death or the cessation of the circulatory system, which is when there is no longer a function of the heart. This halachic question comes with some very serious halachic ramifications, such as, may you have a loved one removed from the life support, from the respiratory machine, if he is determined to have reached the state of being brain dead? Can you be mechalel Shabbos for such a person? Is he considered alive? Another subject that this question touches upon, although its complexity is much greater as it contains other aspects as well, is regarding organ transplants. If the person is still determined alive, then certainly you can't take out his organs, and the discussion of organ transplants can only begin if you determine that being brain dead means you're dead. So let's now open up this discussion and understand the rabbinical debate today amongst whether to follow death of the brain to determine death or not. Who holds of which position? Who are the poskim on each side? And what should one do, chas v'shalom, if he ever enters into such a debate, such a question that's necessary to be determined? So first and foremost, we have to introduce some basic science and medicine of how the brain works and what it is responsible for. Brain function is responsible for the function of many of our organs in our body. It's responsible for our nerve system, and it's also responsible for our respiratory system, which is centered in the lungs. Our ability to breathe comes from a direct order from the brain. The brain signals the lungs to breathe. The oxygen that's brought into the lungs is then placed into the circulatory system, which is within the blood in the heart, and the blood in the heart is then sent to all over the body to give it its oxygen, glucose, water that is required for every cell to survive. Without the brain, or without the lungs, or without the heart, the cells will not be able to get those vital elements, and the person, chas v'shalom, will naturally pass away. So what is brain death? Not to confuse brain death with another very similar state from the peripheral side, which is a coma or a vegetative state, in which the person is unconscious, he's like asleep, but his brain is very much alive. In a coma or a vegetative state, we have lost the consciousness of the person. We have not lost his brain. His brain fully functions. The brain sends the signals to the lungs pump oxygen, breathe in oxygen, give it to the circulatory system, and he's able to live. He doesn't need life support, but he's not conscious. Certainly such a person isn't dead, according to any definition or measurement. Brain death, however, means as follows. The cells of the brain have died. The brain no longer functions. It's a rotting organ, chas v'shalom. Being that that's the case, how can a person breathe? If a person's brain is dead, the cells no longer send the signals to the lungs. That's why we have what's called life support, the respiratory machine, which helps the person breathe artificially. So the respiratory machine takes over the function of the lungs and of the brain. So the heart is still getting his oxygen, and he's still delivering all the nutrients and necessary elements to all the cells of the body, and the person can continue living for a long time in this method. Nonetheless, unlike a coma or a vegetative state, there is no chance of recovery outside of an absolute miracle that's beyond nature, that a person can survive or recuperate from brain death. A coma, a person can come back into consciousness, but not by brain death. So now that we got the facts clear on the ground, let's now analyze it according to halacha. What according to halacha is the determination of life? So we have an explicit verse in Bereshis which says, "V'nafachta ba'apei nishmas chayim." Hashem blew the breath of life into Adam. And it's recorded in the Gemara in Yuma, Mishnah 83a, and the Gemara 84a, that we determine life by whether the person is breathing. If the person has stopped breathing, he's determined as dead, even if somehow he still has a pulse. The pulse is continuing for a few more minutes. The moment he stopped breathing, he's dead. You can't be Mechalel Shabbos anymore. But now the question comes up, in this situation, practically the person's breathing, he's artificially breathing, is connected to a respiratory machine. So must a person be naturally breathing to be determined to still be alive? Or does it suffice to even be artificially breathing, as nonetheless breathing he is and his heart is working? So this is the question that's debated, and before we enter into the details of this halachic debate and the poskim who side with the different approaches, let's first introduce what is the secular approach. Lahavdil elef havdalas. But nonetheless necessary to know if you are a caretaker provider for such a patient or such a relative. So in the United States, the Harvard Medical School in 1968 published a study on this exact issue of the determination of death, which now became coined as the Harvard criteria, in which they determined, based on their research, that brain death is death, and we don't care if you're artificially still living, still breathing, and the heart's still moving. It's impossible to recuperate. You'll never make it back to life. You're dead. This Harvard criteria was accepted into law in the United States in 1981, known as the UDDA, the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which was passed in Congress, and basically allows the states and the hospitals within them to pull the plug to remove a patient from life support if he has been determined to have suffered brain death, as he's dead. In the majority of states, the relatives cannot protest this decision, and it is not their call, it's the call of the doctors in the medical facility. So now let's go into the halachic discussion. One of the first and earliest poskim who dealt with this question was the famed Rav Moshe Feinstein in Igros Moshe Yeredeya, Volume 3, Tshuva 132, and Volume 8, Tshuva 54, in which he basically rules, like the position of Harvard criteria and the law passed in Congress, that if your brain is completely dead and you cannot naturally breathe, artificial breathing and heart pumping doesn't make you be considered alive. You're dead according to halacha. This position of the Igros Moshe, which is documented, was later debated amongst the students if he retracted from this or if he qualified his ruling. And for further information, you can look in the halachic issues in the termination of death and organ transplantation, printed by the RCA a number of years ago on this subject. In Eretz Yisrael, Rabbanut HaRashit in 1986, under the counsel of Mordechai Eliyahu, Rav Shapiro, and Rav Zalman Nechemya Goldberg, together with the leading physicians in the Mochin Slezhenzer Institute of Shaarei Tzedek, likewise accepted this approach. If the brain is dead, the person is dead. The Gemara in Shulchanaruch says we follow the breath. There's no more natural breath. He's dead. However, other Migdali Peiskei Dereinu have vehemently disputed this approach and this ruling, and said that no, the Gemara's intent is only when the person has physically stopped breathing. But if we found an artificial way of making him breathe, he's alive. And there's no precedent to say otherwise. Likewise, some bring proofs from some sources that perhaps the termination of death is likewise joined by the pulse and the work of the heart. This position that he's considered still alive, or we suspect he's considered still alive, is the position of many Rabbanei Eretz Yisrael, including the Minchas Yitzchak in Volume 5, Tshuva 7, Rav Yashiv of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the Tzitz Eliezer in Volume 10, Tshuva 25, Volume 13, Tshuva 89, and other Mepeiskei Dereinu. And thus, this matter is a real serious debate amongst the modern day poskim without a set arbitration. Accordingly, while the trend amongst Haredi jury is to follow the stringent approach, and the trend amongst modern orthodoxy is to follow the lenient approach of Rav Moshe, even though that too is under debate, as written in length in the RCA document, anyone who is a caretaker, a care provider of a Jewish patient in this situation is to contact the halachic authority and receive practical guidance of what to do. Another very important point in this discussion is the determination of brain death. You see, there's different levels of brain death. Even Rab Moshe, who's lenient, agrees it has to be 100% brain death to be considered dead. But if there is slight brain function, not all the cells are dead, there's a little bit of signals being sent to the lungs are partially breathing on their own, maybe not enough to live for more than a minute, but still a little bit of breathing is taking place, says Rab Moshe in his tshuva. The person's not dead, he's alive even in his approach. And quite often it's not so simple to determine 100% brain death, and this is something that's dependent on the medical practitioners in that hospital to do a proper diagnosis. So this is a very serious shaila. Even if you go according to a lenient approach, it's not so simple to just jump on that bandwagon. And therefore, as is all shailas in matters of life and death, one is to contact an expert rabbinical authority who is knowledgeable in this field to get direction of Dvar Hashem zu halacha of what to do. And may Hashem grant us that we should never need to be subject to any of these decisions or questions to begin with. We'll conclude with one more important point, and that is that those who follow the approach of the machmir opinions, who do not consider brain death as death, must be very careful in the United States that when a loved one is entered into a facility and he's determined to be brain dead, you need to try to intervene so the hospital does not pull the plug on him. And to prevent this to begin with, it's proper for every patient to sign on a halachic and legal medical praxi, which sends all the decisions of his medical treatment to need to be authorized by a rabbinical authority, and hence perhaps allow such a patient, Rahman al-Islan, to be transferred to a facility that will allow him to be on life support until his circulatory system stops to work.
Thank you for listening to Shulchanaruchharav.com. Our free services of making Torah knowledge available to the public depends on donors like you. Please help us continue our work through making even a small contribution at Shulchanaruchharav.com under the Daily Halacha Dedication section or in the subscription page. Also, check out our online courses and many sefarim available for purchase that will both enhance your Torah knowledge and help support our work.